So welcome back to a brand new series on Avalonia. For those of you that don't know, Avalonia is a cross-platform UI, so it allows you to develop apps and specifically the user interfaces on Windows, Mac, Linux, mobile, the web, and even Tizen now. You make one UI that works across all platforms. For those of you that already know me, if we go to Avalonia's website and say scroll to the bottom, you'll find I've already got a series on Avalonia showing off some of the basics of the UI and kind of trialing this to see if it was good enough for production. I've liked it so much so that I'm now going to be remaking one of my production software apps called Batch Process that automates SolidWorks modeling and using Avalonia UI to remake this. This series is going to focus on completely remaking my software, so Batch Process, in Avalonia, and you're going to see the entire process start to finish in a real-world application. If we go ahead and take a look at this first, I've already mocked up what the UI is going to look like. And we can see here, this is the UI I've come up with. So this is just all drawn in Affinity Designer. So this isn't actual UI. This is just, images and things drawn. But this is what we want to then convert into Avalonia and a real application. So it's a great starting point for how we want the application to look. It's been over a year since I've used Avalonia. So let's take a look at what's changed. You can see if you go to the new website, it's much better than the one a year or so ago. Much cleaner and more modern. Let's just jump straight into get started. Let's get this installed. So we have a nice and easy install guide here. We can use Visual Studio, which I'd normally prefer, but there's also JetBrains Rider. And recently, literally a month or so ago, they've actually released Rider completely for free. So you no longer have to buy Rider. It was always a paid option. If we now go to Rider's website and say download, well, for one, you kind of can't see the options here. If you go to pricing, you can see they've now got a non-commercial free license. Now, because mine's commercial, I actually own a license, so I've got the full license. But for you guys following along, you can simply download the free version. If you want to use Visual Studio, there's not really any difference you're going to notice. So you could follow along in either one. In my case, using JetBrains Rider, it also wants the Rider extension. So you'd follow this link and install Avalonia Rider. With Rider installed, you can see we have the Avalonia loudness meter, which is what we made in the last series. But we want a new one. So we're going to go new solution. And this is going to bring up this dialog. You can see because we've installed that add-on, we've now got three options here. We've got cross-platform app, MVVM app, and a .NET app. If we jump back to the website, click tutorials, we'll get a bit more information. Jump to getting started and install. We can then see here the difference between an app, an MVVM app, and a cross-platform app. If we scroll over, you'll see here is the key difference. The first two target all the same things, which doesn't include web and mobile by default. And because this app isn't going to be web or mobile, we won't choose cross-platform. We'll keep out that complexity. And instead, we can either choose an app or an MVVM app. I like to implement the MVVM from scratch, so we'll start with a basic app, and then we can always add what the MVVM app would add later on. So for that, we're going to click .NET App. We've got a Riders project. I'll just leave it there for now, and we'll call this one Batch Process 3. I always like to put the solution and the project in the same directory to save on doubling up on directories. Everything else we can leave as default. There's nothing in there we care about. And we'll click Create. You can see we have a warning down the bottom right to configure Microsoft Defender, which we'll do. And now that's all configured. And now let's just see if this works. So we'll click the play button at the top right first. And let's see if we can actually get anything up and running. And that pops up just a window with a black background and welcome to Avalonia. So we know it's all compiled correctly. That's the good start. And I say let's just jump straight into getting some visuals. So we can't see anything at the minute. If we hover up here, there's a button that says Editor and Preview. If we click that, we get a preview open up. And we can leave it at the bottom, I think is better for now. We'll also minimize the other bar, so we have as much workspace to go at. This, you can see, is obviously showing in the preview as a white background and black text. But by default, it's honoring the Windows theme, which I have set to dark. If we take a look at what we want here, the first thing we need to do is visualize how we are going to construct this and what makes the application. So what we want is this section here would be the sidebar. So the whole application would be the main window that we have to think of. This sidebar here, we will have as an actual menu on the main app, if you will, the page. And then in here, I believe we're going to have things that are going to change. So this will be where your pages get loaded in. And really that is as complicated as the top level application gets. So as you know from before, this will be basically a grid. It will be 2 columns, one with a set width, and the other 2 take up the rest of the space. That means in the main window, we'll just do a grid. We'll have a column definitions of, say, 200, and then autofill the remainder. We want the background color to match this background color. So what I can do is get the color picker, select here, click, and get the color. Because we don't want to just dump colors straight into the UI, we want to use styles. We'll go ahead and set them up now. We'll make a new folder. So we'll go add, directory, and we'll call this styles. And now inside of styles, we'll do add new Avalonia styles, and we'll call this app default styles. This will create us the blank styles document, which we can also preview by doing this. Zooming in and say putting some elements in here. So it's got a border with padding, and inside the border we could chuck, say, a button with some content, hello world, and then you can kind of visualize your styles as you apply them here. We need to also make sure this style is included. So if we go to the app XAML here, and inside of styles, we need to make sure we do a style include, and then the source. We should have IntelliSense for styles, app default. That will now include these styles in the application itself. But considering this is actually a background color, it's going to be a brush. That's a resource, not a style. So that will end up living in the app.xaml, not the style. So even though we've made the default styles, we won't actually use that now. We'll make use of that later. But instead in here, we'll want some application resources. And in here now, we'll want a solid color brush and the name. So the way we'll look this up and what we'll call it, we'll give it a primary background. And then inside there, we'll put the color and put a hashtag at the start. That now you can see gives us a preview of the color. And linking all that back in, we can finally do in here, dynamic resource, and then do primary background and close the curly braces. That should now update. We've probably got to build for it to update. And there we go. We have the background color of our application. If we run that again, just to see the difference, you can see there's the background color. So let's just talk over what we've done there. Firstly, in a window, you can only have a single element. So say we get rid of that grid and just put a button with content of button 1. And then we do another button with content of button 2. You can see we'll get this complaint that a window can only have, well, effectively what it's trying to tell you is a window can only have one element. There's various elements you can use, but they are a grid for laying out with set widths and autofills. You have stack panels that simply stack things one on top of the other. So if, say, we get rid of the grid again, and we just do a stack panel, and inside the stack panel we put buttons with content again. You can see now we have buttons stacking on top of each other. You can change the direction to horizontal, so they then stack on top of each other left to right. Whereas a grid, if we change this to a grid, you can see button 1 and 2 stack straight on top of each other, and they don't automatically stack, one below the other. Grids you have to explicitly define, like an Excel spreadsheet. You want rows that go down and columns that go left to right. So for a grid, you could do a column definition, which is left to right, and you can do, say, ***, which is fill and fill. And then in here, you can do grid.column 0, and the second button can go in grid.column 1. That way you can see button 1 is here, button 2 is here, and we have 2 equally spaced columns in the grid. If you set a specific size, say 200, this button now will take up 200 here, and the rest is auto-filled. If we did, say, a star here and 100 here, you get the opposite, where button 1 will take up all the space needed after button 2 is used up 100 display units. So in our case, because we want this sidebar to always be a fixed size in essence, or at least a size that we know of, and this main page or the window to take up the remaining space, we use a grid, not a stack panel. Anywhere you need to fill, if you think of it this way, anywhere you have content that you need to fill a certain amount of area, like the remaining elements, you want to use a grid with a star on one of the definitions. What we've done here then as well is some binding. You'll see this used throughout the UI. So instead of having fixed values, like typing FF0000, for example, to get red, instead of hard coding values inside the view, you can do a binding, which starts with these curly braces and then specify the type of binding. And in this case, it's a dynamic resource because the resource is in the application resources. So this is where it's going to look for it. And then we've set it a key of primary background, which can then be typed in as the resource key primary background. You'll find out that this UI is very similar to web development. So it's kind of got CSS vibes and HTML vibes, hence the kind of XML style bracketing. But it makes UI development much easier. You'll see in a moment how quickly we can turn this literal image into an actual UI. Let's focus on this left panel next, then this side panel, and we want this logo, which I've actually drew in here. So you can see we have all the items here. So if I just copy this to a new document and then export this out now as an SVG, we want to add a new folder, just as normal convention would say, and we'll call it assets. Inside of assets, we'll add another one called images. So we can just right click on the image, click open in Explorer, go to images, and I'll just paste in the logo there. You can see then it's going to add the logo inside of here, and we just need to right click properties and then change the build action to an Avalonia resource. So it gets embedded as an actual image resource. Inside the grid, we want to make this actual section here. So this will be, when it's just a generic container, so you can do a stack panel, which is what we're going to do. So we can stack the image and the buttons on top of each other. But we also first need to have some padding, and stack panels don't have padding. So the kind of generic wrapper element is called a border. It's going to default to the grid column 0, which is what we want. But what we do want is a padding of, say, 20. And now inside of here, because we have, if you remember saying, if you ever need to fill remaining space, we have this button down here, this settings button. So we want this to be a stack panel with all these elements in, but then we need to fill this remaining space and then put another button in. So for that reason, we're going to use another grid inside of here. So we fill a grid in here. And so you can kind of visualize what I'm doing. I'll just also put a background of red here. Here is the current border inside of this section here. The grid, if we do a background of, say, orange, you'll see it's inside, and the border's padding is what's giving us that space. And then this grid just needs row definitions of fill and then auto. So what that will do is the first row will just take up all remaining space, and the second row will take up just what's needed. So in the second row we can put the settings, and in the first row we can put the buttons. So now inside that first row we'll do a stack panel, which is what we can then place all the buttons and images in. And in here we'll start with that image we just imported here, this logo SVG. We'll set the source up, and then we'll open up this kind of binding tab, because this has a specific way of doing SVG images. Now, in order to use SVG images, they're not actually natively supported in Avalonia, but they are in Skia. So all we need to do is go to terminal at the bottom, type in .NET add package avalonia.svg.skia. This will install the package that now supports SVG. And I know this because I had to do it in the last Avalonia tutorials. But if you search Avalonia SVG, you'll come to this GitHub repo. There's what adds the support for SVG. You scroll down and you can see to install for Avalonia. You simply do what we've just done here. And now we have the option to do this, where we can tag in an SVG image and then a path to the files. So that should mean now in here, we can open the curly braces, type SVG image. There we go. And the path now equals assets, images, logo.svg. And there we can see after rebuild, the image has appeared here. So we can zoom in. There's the SVG image loaded nicely. If we just press F5 and see that in an actual window, you can see there's the image. It looks really small and not quite scaled right. So let's just set the width and let's try 220. So that looks about right. Let's now delete this and just change it to auto. So now the first column will just size based on whatever the largest item in that column is. In this case, it's currently the image. If we take a look at this now, that looks better. And let's just size this to a more appropriate size as well. So it's got 800 by 450 as the designer size. So that's the size we see visually here. But when you run the application, there's no width and height currently set. So let's just make this 1024 by 600, say. And let's also do the actual width as 1024 and the height as 600. So this is the height when you run the application, and the D colon is the size for just the preview while you're working away here. So I like to just set them to exactly the same. And now there's the window. So that's scaled more appropriately to this designer. So if we kind of scale them roughly the same, you can see we've actually got a menu that's a bit bigger. So we probably want to scale it down, but instead this is just a rough preview. I think that's kind of where we're at. So we could make this window technically larger like this as we go, we'll see, but that scales pretty good. I also added a kind of gradient here to the sidebar, not just a solid background color. So what we want to do for that is set a linear gradient on the background. We can take this color here, the same as we did before, get the color from here, and now we can make use of the styles. And if we go to the app XAML again, we'll want to put a linear gradient brush in here with a key of primary background gradient. And what we want to do now is specify the start and end point of the gradient, so where one color starts and the other ends. And to do that, we'll do start point as a percentage, so 0 on the X, 0 on the Y, so it starts at the far left, top right. And the end gradient wants to stop at the far right, 100%, and just the top left still. So a straight line from left to right. Inside of the brush, we can now set the actual colors. And for that, there'll just be 2. So we'll have a gradient stop with an offset of 0, and the initial color, which if we color pick from the left side, is 111214. If we copy and paste that again, set this second offset to 1, and this will indicate these points. So 0 will indicate this point, and 1 will indicate this point. The second color is 151E3E. That should give us a gradient from this dark color to the slightly lighter color. And all we need to do now is specify this primary background gradient in this border here. So this will be background dynamic resource, primary background gradient. And then after rebuilding, we can now see there's the gradient. So you can see how really easy this is to build up UI that starts looking exactly like you draw in your normal drawing application. So look how pretty much identical that is already. Just so simple. We've got the colors bang on, the image exactly the same, and this will work on Windows, Mac, and all other platforms you want it to. Let's now move on to buttons. So we'll just add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 buttons here in a row, and then this select button, and then the settings button. Below the image, let's just add a button. The content can say home for now, and you can see we can't see anything because by default everything's like black and not white. So before we use style, let's just do foreground white so we can see it. There's the home. You can even do background, let's just say light blue. And there's the button that you can see that we also need styles on hover. We want this button to fill the remaining space. So what we can do there is have the horizontal alignment set to stretch. That'll now fill the button going across. And then we'd want custom text as well, which we'll come to after, because what we're going to have to do with this button is really make a style or even a template for this button, but a style should do. So let's ignore the styling of the button being wrong for now. Copy and paste this, put in each one, which was home, process, actions, macros, report. So actions, macros, reports, or reporter, and then history. And you can see also the space between them isn't much. Now in a stack panel, that's fixable by doing spacing. We'll set it to about 12, let's say, and that looks okay. So we now got a nice spacing. And taking a look at that, we now have the buttons, although they're not styled, they are where we want them to be. And they match this. We want them to have more padding, a custom font, and some icons, but that's all part of the styling, so we'll leave that for the minute, and we'll get this other button in down here for settings. Because we thought ahead as well, we've already done the grid here, so the grid now has an auto and a fill. So this star will stretch this panel all the way to the bottom, and because there's nothing in the bottom row at the minute, you can't see anything. So all we've got to do for that, in the bottom row, because we literally are just currently going to have a button, we won't bother with a stack panel or anything else, we'll just directly put the button in the second row, which is an index of 1. And to be honest, let's just copy that for now, paste it here, and just set the grid.row to 1. We can then see that extra button now appears at the bottom. Get rid of the stretch. Put in settings, and we'll change that for an icon after. And you can see now that's the sidebar recreated in terms of physical elements ready to use. And we've just got to style them. This inner part here, all the remaining area, will be an actual page. And we're going to have to do a lot of boilerplate code to support going through pages and view models and things like that. But hopefully you can already see how easy Avalonia is, how bug-free and simple just designing UI and styling it to exactly what you want really is compared to most other UI design. I think next up what we'll do is style these buttons using the styles we have in here. We've already added a button there so we can kind of visualize what's going to happen. And before we write a style, you can either write the style directly in here, or you can write the style in the main window. It doesn't really matter. So let's just go ahead and do it all in this window here. And because we want the background to look correct, we will also apply the background gradient here into the styles window. We'll also make it, say, 200, so it's about the right width. And this button can have a horizontal alignment of stretch, just so we can see it. But again, to be honest, that's going to be part of the style. We don't want to do that. So for a style, it's pretty much the same as writing the actual button itself. But what we do, we start with a tag called style. The selector, like a CSS selector in HTML design, will select button elements. So this is going to select all buttons. And then in here, so instead of writing, say, foreground white like this, we do it as a kind of setter. So you open another tag, type setter, property of foreground, and a value of, say, white. And that does the same thing. So it's basically adding elements to the button just in a slightly different way. Let's start with just the font size. So we want the property font size to be, let's try 20. Looks about right. We want the foreground to be white, but instead of hard coding white again, we'll jump into here and continue to make these colors. I'll make another solid brush called primary text, and we'll do a slightly off-white. So CF, CF, CF will be a very kind of light white, but not pure white. In the style then, we can do a dynamic resource of primary text. And that should set the foreground. We might have to compile that for the previewer. There we go. So now we have primary text set. And now let's do the background. And again, we will want a primary background color, which we have. So that's now got the background in. And we can see on the mouse over, we're getting the black text. So to style mouse over events, we make another style, select as button again, and similar to CSS, you do colon, point it over, and specifically on button, and again, I know this from doing Avalonia before, we need to then select into the button. Don't ask why, but this is just how the button's made with the template it originally has. You have to go into the template and then select on the content presenter. So that just boils down to how this button element's been made in the background. And instead of just applying a foreground and background color on hover to the button, which won't always work, you need to select the template and then the content presenter. It's just how it is, basically. If you dove deep into the button design, you'd figure out exactly why. In here, we can now set a new foreground and background color that will act when we hover. And you can see now the hovering's exactly the same. So we could change this, say foreground to red. Now when you hover, you get red. So we want, like before, you'll want primary text and primary background. You'll now want, I'd say, move down here, primary hover, and primary hover text. For the background, we want it to be slightly different on hover, so we want it to be a little bit lighter. So we'll do 333 B5A. So that makes it a light blue. And then the hover text will go to pure white. So it just adds that little bit of extra glow when we hover. And now if we bind that back, we want the foreground to be the primary hover text and the background to be the primary hover, which I guess we should say is primary hover background, to be honest. So it's a bit more clear what it is. And you can even change it to background and foreground. Kind of makes it a bit more obvious. Same with that text, let's just change it to foreground. And there we go. So if we zoom in on the button now, we can see the text gets a little bit lighter and the background glows on hover. That's kind of just a nice effect. If we go back to the window, all we need to do is, we should just be able to rebuild, and these all get the style, which they currently don't. So that must mean these two values I forgot we set. So if we just remove them back to default now, we can see our buttons are now styled nicely. And we have this nice hover effect. Running the actual application, you can see now side by side, we're getting really close to exactly what we want it to look like. We will get it almost pixel perfect. So we need the font to be, or the padding rather, I think to be slightly bigger, and the spacing to be less. We need to introduce icons into the buttons. And then I think we want some kind of animation. So this is a bit harsh, just directly changing. I think we want kind of a soft fade on the background and maybe even slightly growing the text, just to give it a kind of modern visual instead of just completely flat buttons that aren't doing anything. But hopefully that's been a nice quick introduction back into Avalonia, and to see how quickly from nothing we can get an application already looking much better than I think any other UI framework could have ever achieved. There's no way we could have done this quickly in less than an hour from never using Avalonia for a year with any other kind of UI. I did try Maui, and the very first thing I ran into is you can't even do a button with left-aligned text. That's how ridiculous it is, and that's why I never really wanted to go back into Xamarin or Maui, which is effectively just Xamarin with a coat on, and instead we'll stick with Avalonia the whole way. I've never known a UI be so easy and clean to do, and you don't even have to think about what you need to do to get it to work. It's just natural and intuitive. If you have any comments or questions as we go, or if the pace is too quick or too slow, let me know, and I'm happy to explain. And definitely rewatch the other Avalonia tutorials I've made first to give you an overview and details of what a lot of this kind of means. I've also got a playlist on Angel 6 as well for WPF. So even though it's really old now, you're talking, I don't know how many years ago, 7 years ago, this series on WPF is incredibly detailed. There's like 40, 50, 60 hours worth of videos, and everything you learn in this WPF, especially this intro video to WPF, this will take you through what all of these grids mean, what all of the syntax and tags mean, This will kind of help you get going. You can see it's got grids just like Avalonia, stack panels, borders, padding. Everything's almost identical to WPF. So this video specifically will be very useful, but I would still recommend watching through this because all of the knowledge learned will pass into this Avalonia series. By the end, we'll have this entire application up and running, and this will be a fully working application that really does things, so you'll be able to see that as we go. So that's it for the first video, guys. I hope you enjoyed that one, and I'll see you in the next.